In the summer of 1944, American tank crews in Normandy faced a terrifying reality. Their Sherman tanks, the workhorses of the Allied armored forces, could not penetrate the front armor of Germany's Panther tanks at any range. Not at 1,000 yards, not at 500 yards, not even point blank. Firing tests conducted near Issany that July confirmed what tankers already knew from bitter experience. The standard 75mm armor-piercing round would not go through a Panther's Glossies plate, even at 200 yards. German tank crews, meanwhile, could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away with a single well-aimed shot. The asymmetry seemed hopeless. American tankers began calling themselves suicide jockeys. Some crews painted kill marks on their tanks, but these were often lies, because telling the truth would have destroyed what little morale remained. Yet 18 months later, those same Shermans formed the backbone of the most effective combined arms fighting force in history, and German commanders were writing in their after-action reports that American armor had become unstoppable. This is the story of how American tankers, engineers, and commanders systematically dismantled German armored superiority through relentless adaptation, tactical innovation, and industrial might that their enemies never saw coming. German confidence in their heavy tanks was not misplaced. It was earned through years of engineering excellence and battlefield dominance. The Tiger I, fielded from August 1942, carried 100mm of frontal hull armor and mounted the devastating 88mm KWK-36 L-56 gun. That weapon, derived from the legendary Flak-36 anti-aircraft gun that had terrorized Allied tanks in North Africa, could punch through 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters, even when the target plate was angled at 30 degrees. The Tiger weighed 57 tons and required special rail cars for transport, but German commanders considered its combat power worth every logistical headache. The Panther, deployed from mid-1943 as Germany's response to the Soviet T-34, featured an 80mm Glossies plate sloped at 55 degrees from vertical. Simple trigonometry meant that slope created an effective thickness of roughly 140mm against incoming fire. The Panther's long-barreled 75mm KWK-42 L-70 gun, with a barrel over 16 feet long, could penetrate 124mm of 30-degree plate at 500 yards. Against these machines, the Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could manage only about 61mm of penetration against 30-degree plate at 500 yards. At any typical combat range, a Panther or Tiger could kill a Sherman with virtually any frontal hit. The Sherman could not return the favor, even at point-blank range. This imbalance bred dangerous overconfidence among German tank crews, who began to view combat against American armor as something approaching sport. At the Battle of Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann and 4 other Tigers from the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion caught a British column of the 22nd Armored Brigade halted along a narrow road. The British tankers, enjoying a tea break after a successful advance, had no idea what was about to hit them. In under 15 minutes, the Tigers destroyed roughly 13 to 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and numerous transport vehicles. Cromwells, Fireflies, and Stuarts burst into flames one after another, while their crews scrambled desperately to escape. The action became legendary in German propaganda, though historian John Buckley has cautioned that accounts attributing the entire engagement to Wittmann alone essentially repackaged Nazi propaganda that was designed to create heroes for a faltering war effort. The widely quoted remark attributed to Field Marshal R.M.L. that one Tiger was worth 4 Shermans, but the Americans always brought 5, captures the German mindset perfectly, though its provenance remains unverified and is likely apocryphal, created after the war to explain German defeat. Historian Stephen Zoga has observed that most of the tank aces of World War II were simply lucky enough to have an invulnerable tank with a powerful gun, a pointed observation about the distinction between crew skill and mechanical advantage. German doctrine doubled down on this qualitative superiority, building an entire tactical philosophy around the killing power of individual heavy tanks. Tiger crews trained extensively in the Maldsight-Stellung, a positioning technique that involved angling the hull 45 degrees to maximize effective armor to 180 millimeters frontally and 140 millimeters on the angled side. They practiced engaging at extreme ranges where their superior optics and powerful guns gave them decisive advantage. The entire late-war Panzer philosophy assumed that a single well-positioned heavy tank could dominate an entire battlefield sector, holding off superior numbers through firepower and protection. This assumption contained a fatal flaw that would prove catastrophic. It depended on fighting a war of tank versus tank duels when the Americans were already building a completely different kind of war, one where the tank was merely one component of an integrated killing machine. The M4 Sherman was never designed to fight other tanks. This was not an oversight, but a deliberate doctrinal choice. American pre-war doctrine, codified in Field Manual 1710, explicitly assigned tanks to infantry support, exploitation, and pursuit. Tanks were supposed to pour through gaps in enemy lines and wreak havoc in rear areas, not engage in armored duels. Tank versus tank combat was delegated to specialized tank destroyer battalions, equipped with fast, lightly armored vehicles like the M10 Wolverine and M18 Hellcat, whose high-velocity guns and speed were meant to ambush enemy tanks from concealed positions. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun was selected for its excellent high-explosive round, which packed 1.5 pounds of TNT and was ideal for destroying fortifications, gun emplacements, machine gun nests, and infantry positions. The gun could fire 10 to 12 rounds per minute with a well-trained crew, far faster than German tanks, and the gyro stabilizer allowed reasonable accuracy while moving at low speeds. At roughly 33 tons combat loaded, the Sherman could cross every bridge in Europe without worrying about weight limits. Fit on standard rail cars without modification and ship efficiently by sea in Liberty ship holds. Its 5-man crew operated from a comparatively roomy interior with large spring-loaded hatches above each position, a feature that would later prove critical for survivability when things went wrong. The design philosophy worked well enough against Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs in North Africa during 1942 and early 1943. The Sherman's superior gun depression, faster turret traverse, and better reliability gave American crews advantages that offset the German tanks' slightly superior armor. But when heavier German armor appeared, the reckoning came fast and brutal. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass from February 14 through 24, 1943, the first major American engagement with German ground forces, Rommel's Arracourt devastated the inexperienced U.S. Second Corps. Tiger I tanks from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion spearheaded the assault, and American tankers discovered to their horror that their guns were useless against the massive German machines. The 1st Armored Division lost 44 M4 tanks on the first day alone. Crews watched their rounds bounce harmlessly off Tiger hulls, while return fire punched clean through Sherman armor, often detonating the ammunition and incinerating everyone inside. Total Allied losses reached 183 tanks and 10,000 casualties, including 6,500 Americans, against roughly 2,000 Axis casualties and 34 tanks. The debacle led to Major General Lloyd Fredendall's replacement by Patton and forced a painful reassessment of American armored doctrine. But the lessons learned at Kasserine would take many months to fully implement, and by the time they were, the Germans had deployed something even more dangerous than the Tiger. The real crisis came in Normandy in the summer of 1944.
Pre-invasion intelligence had characterized the Panther as a rare heavy tank, seen only in separate battalions, similar to the Tiger. Intelligence officers assured commanders that Panthers would be encountered only occasionally in small numbers. In reality, 38% of German tanks in Normandy were Panthers integrated into standard Panther division regiments as their primary medium tank. The Panther had effectively replaced the Panzer IV in German doctrine. When Shermans encountered them in the hedgerow country, crews watched in horror as their 75mm rounds bounced harmlessly off the Panther's sloped glacis like tennis balls off a wall. The geometry was merciless. Even the newly arriving 76mm gun, rushed to Europe after urgent requests from field commanders, could not penetrate the Panther's front armor at any range with standard ammunition. Tank crews began reporting that combat against Panthers was suicide. Some units experienced 50% casualties in single engagements. Morale plummeted. The fire risk compounded crew terror and gave the Sherman a deadly reputation that would haunt it for decades. Early dry stowage. Shermans stored 75mm rounds in sponson racks along the hull sides, directly in the path of penetrating hits. When a German round punched through the armor, hot fragments would ignite the propellant charges, and the resulting fire would spread to adjacent rounds in milliseconds. A U.S. Army study found that 60 to 80% of penetrated dry stowage Shermans caught fire with propellant chain reactions, incinerating the fighting compartment in seconds. Crews had perhaps 3 to 5 seconds to escape before the ammunition cooked off and turned the tank into an inferno. Those who made it out often suffered horrible burns. Those who did not were found as charred remains welded to their seats. The Germans nicknamed the Sherman Tommy Cooker after the small British field stoves. The myth that American tankers called it the Ronson, supposedly from the lighter slogan, "Lights first time, every time," has been largely debunked by modern historians who have searched wartime records extensively. That specific Ronson slogan did not appear in advertisements until December 1950, 5 years after the war ended, and no wartime primary source using Ronson as a Sherman nickname has been found. The fire problem was brutally real, but critically, it was caused by ammunition storage, not by the gasoline engines that popular history often blames. German tanks used gasoline too, and the Panzer IV actually caught fire more frequently than the Sherman after penetration because of its own ammunition storage issues. The infamous claim that it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther is a post-war myth with no basis in historical combat records. This myth has proven remarkably persistent in popular culture, appearing in documentaries, video games, and Hollywood films as if it were established fact. Zaloga has written definitively that the popular myths about Panthers enjoying a 5-to-1 kill ratio against Shermans have no basis at all in the historical records. Actual combat data shows American M4s lost roughly 1.9 Shermans for every 3 Panthers destroyed, a ratio far more favorable than popular imagination suggests. The myth traces largely to Belton Cooper's 1998 memoir, Death Traps, which became a surprise bestseller and shaped public perception of the Sherman for a generation. Professional historians, including Zaloga and Nicholas Moran, have extensively criticized the book for lacking footnotes, containing numerous factual errors, and reflecting the skewed perspective of an ordnance recovery officer who only encountered destroyed tanks. Cooper never saw the tanks that survived, never interviewed crews who won engagements, and never had access to German loss records. His sample was inherently biased. The American response to the Sherman's shortcomings unfolded across multiple tracks simultaneously, demonstrating the adaptive capacity that would ultimately prove decisive. Some solutions came from ordnance engineers in stateside arsenals, working on the clock to develop new weapons. Others were improvised by desperate crews in the field, using whatever materials they could scrounge. The 76mm gun represented the most significant firepower upgrade. Development of the 76mm T1 gun began in summer 1942, before the Sherman had even seen significant combat. Ordnance engineers knew that a more powerful gun would eventually be needed, and they began working on the solution before the problem fully manifested. But institutional resistance delayed deployment for nearly 2 years. When the Armored Board tested 12 prototype 76mm Shermans from February through April 1943, they rejected the design on multiple grounds. The cramped original turret was unsatisfactory for operating the longer gun, the muzzle blast was severe, and most importantly, the 76mm high explosive round was inferior to the 75mm round for infantry support, the mission Army doctrine still considered primary. Armored commanders focused on the infantry support role saw little reason to sacrifice high explosive performance for armor penetration they did not expect to need. The breakthrough came when engineers adopted the larger T-23 turret, originally designed for an entirely different tank, solving the space problem. First production M4A176W Shermans rolled off Press Steel Car Company's line in January 1944, 6 months before D-Day. Yet no 76mm Shermans landed on the Normandy beaches. Field commanders had turned them down, preferring the 75mm's superior high explosive performance for the hedgerow fighting they anticipated. They would bitterly regret this decision within weeks. After encountering Panthers in strength, General Bradley sent urgent messages demanding 76mm Shermans. 102 M4A176W tanks were rushed to France aboard fast transports. Seeing first combat during Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, the 76mm roughly doubled armor penetration over the 75.
Achieving 109 millimeters versus 73 millimeters at 1,000 meters. But testing against captured Panthers revealed a devastating truth. The new gun still could not defeat the Panther's glacis at any range with standard ammunition. Even General Eisenhower, normally diplomatic, expressed fury in a meeting with ordnance officers, saying that ordnance told me the 76mm would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you cannot knock out a damn thing with it. HVAP ammunition, standing for High Velocity Armor Piercing, offered the next leap forward. The T4 M93 round used a tungsten carbide core inside a lightweight aluminum steel body, achieving a muzzle velocity of 1,036 meters per second versus 792 meters per second for standard 76mm armor-piercing rounds. This velocity increase translated to approximately 150 millimeters of penetration at 1,000 meters against flat plate, enough to threaten any German tank. However, HVAP performed poorly against highly sloped armor due to ricochet tendency. The tungsten core would deflect rather than bite into angled surfaces. This meant the Panther's glacis remained effectively impervious even to HVAP, despite its theoretical penetration advantage. The turret mantle and lower hull became vulnerable at moderate ranges, giving American gunners their first realistic shot at a Panther's front, but only if they could hit those specific areas under combat stress. The critical problem was supply. Tungsten carbide was desperately scarce, needed for machine tool bits and other industrial applications as much as for ammunition. Monthly HVAP receipts in the European theater crawled from 1,000 rounds in September 1944 to 5,000 by November, with priority going to tank destroyer units whose entire mission depended on killing enemy armor. By February 1945, the average 76mm Sherman crew had received roughly 5 HVAP rounds total, about 1 per month per tank. Crews hoarded these precious rounds like gold, saving them for confirmed heavy tank engagements and using standard ammunition for everything else. Some commanders instituted strict rules about when HVAP could be fired, requiring visual confirmation of a Tiger or Panther before authorizing its use. Wet storage addressed the fire catastrophe directly through elegant engineering.
Introduced on production tanks from February 1944, the system relocated ammunition from vulnerable sponson racks to double-walled bins on the hull floor below the turret basket, where they were protected by the tank's full armor. The space between the bin walls was filled with a water-ethylene glycol rust inhibitor mixture. When a penetrating round punctured a bin, the liquid would pour out and douse the propellant before it could ignite, buying crucial seconds for the crew to escape. The results were dramatic and immediate. Burn rates dropped from 60 to 80% to just 10 to 15%, making wet stowage Shermans among the least flammable tanks of the war, actually safer than most German designs, since crew casualties averaged 1.28 per loss in burned tanks versus 0.78 in non-burning tanks. The wet stowage system saved hundreds of American lives over the final year of the war in Europe. Field modifications filled the gap between what the factory delivered and what combat demanded, demonstrating the ingenuity of American soldiers under pressure. Crews welded spare track links to hulls and turrets, reasoning that the additional steel would stop or deflect enemy rounds. They piled sandbags on glacis plates, sometimes stacking them several layers deep. Some crews poured concrete up to 6 inches thick on front armor, creating improvised applique protection. Expert assessment, however, was harsh. Sandbags and track links provided negligible protection against high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, traveling at over 2,000 feet per second. Worse, the added weight strained transmissions and suspensions, and the uneven distribution could actually normalize incoming projectiles, negating the Sherman's armor slope and making penetration more likely rather than less. Patton banned sandbags in his Third Army after ordnance officers advised they were useless and harmful to the tank's mechanical systems. The most effective field modification came from Patton's own workshops, where skilled welders attached armor plates salvaged from knocked-out American and German tanks, including Panther glacis plates, with their excellent ballistic properties, to operational Shermans. Approximately 36 of these improvised jumbos were supplied to each of his 3 armored divisions in spring 1945. The M4A3E8, or Easy Eight, combined every major late-war improvement into a single outstanding package. It mounted the 76mm gun with its improved penetration, featured wet stowage to protect the crew, and rode on the new HVSS horizontal spring suspension with wider 23-inch tracks that dramatically reduced ground pressure from 14 to 11 pounds per square inch. This improved cross-country mobility proved critical during the mud and snow of winter 1944 through 45, when narrower-tracked German tanks often bogged down. The Easy Eight could go places the Panther could not, a crucial tactical advantage. Production began at Detroit Tank Arsenal in August 1944, with 2,617 built during the war. The 4th Armored Division received its first Easy Eights in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Creighton Abrams' final command tank, Thunderbolt 7, was an M4A3E8 fitted with salvaged armor plates welded on Third Army workshops. Perhaps no single field innovation captured the American genius for improvisation better than the Culin hedgerow cutter, a device that transformed the Normandy campaign. The Normandy bocage consisted of ancient earthen dikes up to 15 feet tall and 12 feet thick, crowned with dense hedges whose roots had been growing and interlocking for centuries. These obstacles reduced tank warfare to a crawl. Tanks attempting to climb over hedges exposed their thin belly armor to German soldiers armed with Panzerfausts, the cheap and deadly shaped charge weapons that could destroy any tank at close range. Each hedge became a death trap. Average American advance was roughly 1 mile per day, with appalling casualties. Near Les Dupree, Americans counted 1,000 killed per kilometer of advance.
Commanders grew desperate for solutions. The breakthrough came from Sergeant Curtis Grubb Culin III, a 29-year-old from Cranford, New Jersey, serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron under 5th Corps. Culin was not an engineer or a tank crewman, but a cavalry scout. Yet his outside perspective proved invaluable. During a brainstorming session about the bocage problem, where officers and enlisted men threw out ideas regardless of rank, a soldier described by historian Max Hastings as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts suggested putting sore teeth on the front of a tank to cut through the hedges like a bulldozer. While others laughed at the seemingly naive suggestion, Culin, described by Hastings as an honest man who later tried to credit Roberts for the original concept, recognized the potential. He fashioned 4 steel tusk-like prongs from salvaged German, Czech, hedgehog beach obstacles, the X-shaped barriers that had lined the Normandy beaches on D-Day, and welded them to a tank's bow. When the Sherman charged a hedgerow at speed, the tusks bored into the base of the earthen dike, pinning the tank's belly down and allowing it to burst through under a canopy of dirt and roots rather than riding up and over the top with its vulnerable underside exposed. Around July 14, 1944, Culin demonstrated the device for Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, who immediately recognized its significance. Bradley later wrote that the absurdly simple tusk-like device had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks, and he could not understand why none of his engineering experts had thought of it first. He immediately ordered emergency mass production. Over the next 11 days, every ordnance unit in 1st Army worked around the clock, fabricating roughly 500 Rhino devices from German beach obstacle scrap that was plentiful and free. Additional arc welding equipment was flown in from England overnight. By Operation Cobra's launch on July 25th, approximately 3 out of every 5 1st Army tanks carried the device. Bradley kept them secret until Cobra to preserve the element of surprise, forbidding photographs and limiting knowledge of the modification. Zaloga has offered a nuanced assessment of the Rhino's actual impact. The device's tactical significance during Cobra itself was less dramatic than often portrayed, since the pre-attack bombardment churned terrain into moonscape that tanks could cross without hedge cutters, and the subsequent exploitation phase moved along roads rather than cross-country. But the device's psychological and operational significance was undeniably real. It restored confidence and capability in hedgerow terrain when both had been utterly shattered. Tankers who had felt helpless against the bocage now had a tool that worked. Culin received the Legion of Merit for his invention. 4 months later, he lost a leg to a landmine in the brutal Hurtgen forest fighting. He died in 1963 at age 48, his contribution memorialized in the memoirs of both Eisenhower and Bradley as an example of American ingenuity. If a single battle demonstrated that the Sherman, properly employed, could defeat Germany's best tanks in open combat, it was the Battle of Arracourt. From September 18th through 29th, 1944, Patton's Third Army had raced across France after Operation Cobra, covering ground at a pace that astonished German commanders. But fuel shortages caused by Operation Market Garden's logistical priority stalled the advance in Lorraine. The 12th Corps' 4th Armored Division established defensive positions near the town of Arracourt, with Combat Command A under Colonel Bruce Clark and the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams as its primary striking force. The German 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Montefeil assembled 262 tanks and assault guns, including 107 factory new Panthers in Panzer Brigades 111 and 113 for a counteroffensive aimed at retaking Luneville and destroying the exposed American spearhead. The German force looked formidable on paper, a mass of the most modern tanks Germany could produce, but it concealed a fatal weakness that would prove decisive. The Panzer Brigade crews had received only 2 weeks of training before being thrown into combat. They could not read maps effectively, lacked integral reconnaissance units to scout ahead, and had never trained together as cohesive units.
Veteran tankers had been killed on the Eastern Front faster than replacements could be trained. These green crews were ordered to attack blind into American positions held by combat veterans who had been fighting continuously since Normandy and knew their business thoroughly. September 19th opened with heavy fog blanketing the Lorraine countryside, and this weather changed everything. The fog reduced engagement distances to a few hundred meters, completely neutralizing the Panther's lethal advantage at range. German tank doctrine assumed engagements would begin at 1,000 meters or more, where superior German optics and gun accuracy would be decisive. At close range in fog, these advantages vanished. Captain Kenneth Lamison of C Company 37th Tank Battalion positioned his Shermans in hull-down positions along the Metz-Strasbourg road approximately 3 minutes before 8 Panthers emerged from the mist. The German crews, disoriented in the fog and expecting to find empty roads, had no idea American tanks were waiting. Lamison's crews knocked out 4 Panthers with their first shots before the Germans could even identify where the fire was coming from. The surviving Panthers tried to retreat, but the Americans withdrew, repositioned rapidly thanks to their superior mobility, and ambushed them again, destroying the remaining 4. 8 Panthers lost without a single Sherman hit. Captain Jimmy Leach of B Company engaged more Panthers near Rouchet with similar results. The inexperienced German crews panicked under fire they could not effectively return. Leach later recalled with amazement that they abandoned the battlefield, put those Panther tanks in high gear, and took off over a hill, leaving their infantry support behind. A platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers guarding Combat Command A headquarters spotted Panthers advancing on the command post and destroyed 8 of them in rapid succession from concealed positions, demonstrating exactly how tank destroyers were supposed to work. By day's end, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 43 tanks destroyed, mostly factory-new Panthers crewed by men who had been civilians weeks earlier, plus approximately 200 infantry. Combat Command A reported losing just 5 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers across the entire 12-day battle. Zaloga's analysis is definitive. A combination of concealed defensive positions, command of local terrain elevations, and clever fire and maneuver tactics allowed Combat Command A to negate the superior armor and firepower of the German armor. Arracourt proved beyond doubt that crew quality and tactical training could be far more important than the technical specifications of the tanks themselves. The best tank in the world was worthless if its crew could not use it effectively. The American transformation went beyond any single upgrade or battle. It was doctrinal, representing a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about armored warfare. The evolution from a tank-centric approach to combat arms integration brought together armor, infantry, artillery, air power,
and engineers into a unified killing system that no German tank, however formidable its specifications, could survive alone. Air-ground coordination represented perhaps the most significant tactical innovation of the campaign. General Elwood Pete Quesada, commanding 9th Tactical Air Command, revolutionized cooperation between armor and aircraft by placing VHF aircraft radios, the SCR-522, directly in lead Sherman tanks with Air Force liaison officers riding alongside tank commanders. The tanker communicated with fellow armor via SCR-528, while the liaison officer talked to orbiting P-47 Thunderbolts via SCR-522. For the first time, tank commanders could call in airstrikes on targets they could see from their hatches. First Lieutenant Robert Ruler described the system from the pilot's perspective. You would have an Army guy and a Sherman tank talking to you on the radio. When you appeared overhead, he would say something like, "We need you to bomb the German tank hiding behind the little farmhouse with the red roof." You could see exactly what he was talking about. Fighter bombers preceded armored columns in 1-hour shifts, 4 aircraft per flight, with 4 more on ground alert, ready to scramble. Modern scholarship has shown that direct air-to-tank kills were vastly overclaimed during and after the war. Operational research conducted at Mortain found only 9 of 46 German tanks lost were actually attributable to aircraft attack, against pilot claims of 252 destroyed. Rockets and bombs proved far less accurate against moving tanks than pilots believed, but air power's indirect effects were enormous and probably more important than direct kills. Constant air attack disrupted German movement, destroyed supply trucks and fuel bowsers, cut communication lines, and inflicted psychological terror that German prisoners described as devastating to morale. The Jabbo threat, their term for fighter bombers, restricted German movement to darkness and forced tanks off main roads into terrain where they were more likely to break down or get stuck. A Panther that could not move because fuel trucks had been destroyed was just as useless as one that had been bombed. American artillery was, by both Allied and German assessment, the most effective of any combatant in the war. A weapon system that Germans learned to fear more than tanks or aircraft. The VT proximity fuse, first authorized for ground combat during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, after being held in reserve for fear the technology would be captured and copied, represented a quantum leap in artillery effectiveness. The tiny radar in each shell detonated the round approximately 20 to 30 feet above ground level, showering shrapnel over wide areas. Troops in foxholes who would have survived ground burst rounds were killed by air bursts directly overhead. Patton reported that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating. He described catching a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killing, by actual count, 72. He called the fuse significant enough to require a revision of the tactics of land warfare. Infantry-tank coordination evolved through painful trial and error as units learned that neither arm could survive without the other. The critical breakthrough in communication came when Captain Edward D. Miller, S3 of the 743rd Tank Battalion, rigged an EE8 field telephone in a .30 caliber ammo box on the rear hull of a Sherman, wired into the tank's intercom system. This simple modification allowed an infantryman to walk up behind the tank and speak directly to the crew, without exposing himself to fire or trying to shout over engine noise. Before this innovation, infantry had tried banging on tank holes with rifle butts or climbing on top to shout into hatches, often getting killed in the process. Infantry proved essential for spotting the concealed anti-tank guns that were actually the single greatest killer of Shermans throughout the campaign, and for neutralizing Panzerfaust teams lurking in buildings and hedgerows. A Sherman without infantry support was blind and vulnerable. Infantry without tank support was pinned and slaughtered. The bocage fighting forced the most developed combined arms drill of the war. Artillery suppression came first, with shells plastering the next hedgerow line. Then a Rhino-equipped tank breached the hedgerow, bursting through in a shower of dirt while firing high explosive and machine guns at suspected enemy positions. Infantry followed through the breach immediately behind the tank, fanning out to clear enemy soldiers from their bullholes. Engineers came next to clear mines and obstacles. Then the entire sequence repeated at the next hedgerow. It was slow, brutal, and costly, but it worked. Standard Sherman platoon tactics against heavy armor codified the flanking approach that experience had proven effective. One section of 2 tanks engaged the enemy frontally, pinning attention and forcing the enemy gunner to choose a target, while the other section of 2 to 3 tanks executed a wide encircling movement to hit the dramatically thinner side armor. Against the Panther, this was the difference between impossibility and lethality. The Panther's 40mm side armor could be penetrated by a 75mm Sherman at virtually any combat range, versus the impervious 140mm effective frontal glacis. A Panther that could see only enemies in front of it was deadly. A Panther trying to cover threats from multiple directions was vulnerable.
The production disparity between American and German armor was not merely advantageous, it was civilizationally decisive, reflecting fundamental differences in industrial capacity that no amount of German engineering excellence could overcome. The United States produced 49,324 M4 Shermans across 11 factories spread across the American heartland, safe from enemy bombing. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers, 1,347 Tiger Is, and 489 Tiger IIs across the entire war, with factories constantly disrupted by Allied bombing and raw material shortages.
A Sherman required roughly 48,000 man-hours to build. A Tiger I required an estimated 300,000 man-hours, meaning America could produce approximately 6 Shermans for every Tiger Germany could manage. The Chrysler Detroit tank arsenal alone, the largest Sherman producer, turned out 22,234 tanks, nearly 4 times Germany's entire Panther production. But raw numbers tell only part of the story. The Sherman's mechanical reliability was a force multiplier that German tanks could not match, keeping American armor in the fight, while German tanks sat broken in repair depots. British long-distance trials concluded Shermans were utterly reliable and infinitely superior in every other way, particularly in reliability with a minimum of maintenance. Sherman engines averaged roughly 3,000 miles before major overhaul. The Panther, by contrast, debuted catastrophically at Kursk in July 1943, where 50% of vehicles became inoperative before even reaching the battle area due to mechanical failure. 2/3 of breakdowns came from engine overheating and fires, 1/3 from transmission and final drive problems. Panther operational availability averaged just 37% in February 1944 and improved to 78% by the end of May that year under ideal conditions, though it fluctuated widely depending on unit and circumstances. The Panther's spur-beer final drive was chronically weak and prone to stripping under stress, and no comprehensive fix was ever introduced, despite years of complaints from crews. A post-war French Army study examining captured Panthers found evidence that many had been sabotaged during production by forced laborers who loosened bolts or introduced contaminants into lubricants. The American echelon maintenance system ensured damaged Shermans returned to battle rapidly, while German tanks languished waiting for spare parts that never came. Each tank company had its own M32 tank recovery vehicle that could tow damaged tanks to battalion maintenance. Battalion, division, and corps ordnance units provided progressively more capable repair facilities. The Sherman shared hull and chassis components with the M10 and M36 tank destroyers, M7 Priest self-propelled artillery, and M32 recovery vehicles, creating a vast common parts ecosystem where the same transmission or engine could fit multiple vehicle types. Transmissions were manufactured by 6 different companies with fully interchangeable parts, ensuring no single factory bombing could halt production. Pattern's 3rd Army Ordnance Workshops demonstrated remarkable improvisation, modifying 14,000 captured German spark plugs to refurbish Sherman engines and producing 108 improvised jumbos by welding salvaged armor onto standard tanks. When factory jumbos proved unavailable, the Red Bull Express, operating from August 25 to November 16, 1944, demonstrated American logistical prowess on a scale Germany could not match. This dedicated supply convoy system delivered 412,193 tons of supplies along one-way loop routes stretching from Normandy beaches to the front lines, peaking at 12,500 tons per day across nearly 6,000 vehicles running around the clock. African American soldiers comprised approximately 75% of Red Bull Express drivers, serving in transportation units while facing discrimination that barred them from combat roles. Their contribution was essential to victory. This logistical juggernaut meant American armored divisions could replace tank losses almost as fast as they occurred. The 3rd Armored Division lost the equivalent of 580% of its original Sherman complement across the European campaign, meaning it was completely rebuilt nearly 6 times over, yet remained combat effective throughout because replacements arrived continuously.
Germany's dispersed Tiger production, chronic spare parts shortages, and collapsing transportation network meant that by February 5, 1945, the entire Western Front held only 190 operational German tanks against approximately 10 times that number of Allied armor. Germany's qualitative advantage had drowned in a sea of American quantity. The Battle of the Bulge provided the final definitive demonstration of the transformed American armored force when Germany launched its desperate Ardennes offensive on December 16, 1944, deliberately timed during weather that grounded Allied air power. It was Camp Grupper's 117 tanks, including Tiger IIs from the 501st Heavy SS Panzer Battalion, that spearheaded the assault. This was Germany's last armored reserve, its final hope of splitting the Allied armies. Yet even this powerful force was systematically ground down by American combined arms fighting with desperate determination. At Stoumont, 4 Shermans from the 743rd Tank Battalion engaged Piper's Panthers in a fierce, short-range firefight that delayed the German advance for critical hours. The hastily equipped 740th Tank Battalion, originally trained as a searchlight unit for illuminating night battlefields before being given Shermans from depots and thrown into combat with minimal training, fought at Stoumont with desperate courage, despite lacking experience. By December 24th, Piper was out of fuel and ammunition, his spearhead blunted. He abandoned his remaining vehicles, including the precious Tiger IIs, and retreated on foot through American lines with 800 survivors, leaving the pride of German armor sitting empty in the snow. The relief of Bastogne became Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' defining moment and one of the most celebrated actions of American armor in the war. Ordered north on December 18th, when the German offensive scope became clear, the 4th Armored Division completed a 150-mile, 19-hour road march through bitter cold and attacked from assembly areas near Arlon, Belgium. Fighting through elements of the 5th Vichem Jager Division across snow, ice, and minefields that cost tanks and men at every crossroad, Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, down to just 20 operational tanks, spotted C-47 transports parachuting desperately needed supplies into besieged Bastogne on December 26th. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had been holding out for days, running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. From his Sherman Thunderbolt 4, Abrams radioed for permission to advance without waiting for supporting units. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, impatient with delays, he told his men, "We're going into those people now."
Let her roll. He personally destroyed a German self-propelled gun at 1,000 yards with a single shot from Thunderbolt's main gun. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the lead M4A3E8 Jumbo named Cobra King, pushed through the village of Asanoa against fierce resistance. Bogus later recalled that he used the 75mm like it was a machine gun, firing 21 rounds in minutes at anything that moved. At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon, Bogus's Cobra King reached the Bastogne perimeter. Bogus climbed from his hatch and shook hands with Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 101st Airborne, completing one of the most dramatic relief operations of the war. Abrams exemplified the American tanker's transformation from outgunned underdog to master of combined arms warfare. He wore out 7 tanks during the campaign, all named Thunderbolt, never having one shot out from under him because he understood how to use terrain, speed, and supporting arms to survive. Patton's assessment was characteristically direct. "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He's the world champion." Abrams earned 2 Distinguished Service Crosses at Arracourt and Bastogne, rose to full general after the war, commanded all U.S. forces in Vietnam during the most difficult years of that conflict, and became Army Chief of Staff. The M1 Abrams main battle tank bears his name as America's tribute to one of its greatest armored warriors. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Pool of the 3rd Armored Division compiled what is recognized as the top American tank ace record of the war.
He achieved 12 confirmed tank kills and 258 armored vehicle and self-propelled gun kills in just 81 days of continuous combat from June 27 through September 19, 1944, with his consistent crew in 3 successive Shermans, all named In Mood, after the famous Glenn Miller song. Pool's aggressive tactics and exceptional crew coordination made him legendary within his division. His gunner, Corporal Willis Groundhog Ola, destroyed a Panther at 1,500 yards with a single 76mm round through the side armor, a shot that demonstrated what a skilled crew could do with an adequately gunned Sherman. Pool's combat career ended when his third In the Mood was ambushed by a Panther near the Siegfried Line. The replacement gunner, who had just joined the crew, was killed, and Pool lost a leg, ending his days as a tank commander. He survived the war and lived until 1991. Brad Pitt's character War Daddy in the 2014 film Fury was inspired by Pool's exploits. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, holds a special place in this story. As the first African-American armored unit in combat, they fought 183 consecutive days across 6 countries after entering combat on November 7, 1944, proving their worth against enemy fire while facing discrimination from their own army. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, whose Sherman hit a mine, tearing his leg open to the bone on November 16th, refused evacuation despite excruciating pain and the certainty of infection. He knew his men needed him. 3 days later, engaging German tanks near Gibling, France, Rivers spotted enemy armor moving to flank his unit. He radioed his final words before advancing to meet them. "I see them. We'll fight them." His tank was destroyed, and Rivers was killed. His Medal of Honor was denied for decades due to racial discrimination, with paperwork mysteriously lost and witnesses ignored. The award was finally presented on January 13, 1997, over 52 years after his death, when President Clinton honored 7 African-American World War II veterans whose valor had been overlooked because of the color of their skin. The Germans' failure in the end was not one of engineering excellence, but of strategic imagination. They built superb tanks, perhaps the finest of the war in pure technical terms, and assumed tank versus tank supremacy would prove decisive in modern warfare. The Americans built a good enough tank, a tank that was adequate rather than exceptional in any single category, and then constructed an entire system of warfare around it that no enemy could defeat. Air-ground integration provided constant surveillance and firepower. Devastating artillery could obliterate any position within minutes of being identified. Combined arms infantry tank teams cleared terrain that neither arm could take alone. Unmatched logistics kept the machine running, an industrial base that could absorb losses no adversary could inflict fast enough ensured the Army grew stronger even as it suffered casualties. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the chief architect of the original tank destroyer doctrine, who had insisted there could be no basis for the T-26 heavy tank other than the conception of a tank versus tank duel, which he believed unsound and unnecessary, was killed by friendly fire during Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944. American bombs aimed at German positions fell short and struck his observation post. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by friendly fire in the war, though not the highest-ranking killed overall. His death, tragic as it was, removed perhaps the most consequential doctrinal obstacle to American armored development, allowing the heavy tank program to proceed that would eventually produce the M26 Pershing. By war's end, the transformation was complete. Wet stowage had cut Sherman fire rates by 80%, making what had been a death trap into one of the safest tanks to crew. The 76mm with HVAP gave crews a fighting chance against Panther mantlets and Tiger weak points. The Easy Eight's HVSS suspension made the Sherman more mobile in mud and snow than the heavier Panther, which often bogged down in conditions the American tank could traverse. American artillery, VT fuses, and fighter-bomber coordination made every Sherman engagement a combined arms event that no isolated German tank, however superior its specifications, could survive. The war was not won by the tank that could kill at 2,000 meters. It was won by the tank that could be built by the tens of thousands, fixed in hours by mechanics using interchangeable parts, supplied across continents by an industrial democracy at the peak of its power, and fought by crews who learned, at terrible cost, measured in burned bodies and grieving families, to use every tool available to them. The Germans built the better tank. The Americans built the better army. In the end, that made all the difference.